Welcome, participants, panel, honored guests to the Global Sustainable Aquaculture Roadmap, charting a course for sector transformation. And this session is about the launch of that Global Sustainable Aquaculture Roadmap. So welcome. And Christian, could you open the session with some remarks?
Thank you very much, and thank you all to our panelists, and delighted to see you all here this morning here in Panama, and those joining us online, delightful to have you with us at this auspicious occasion. You know, really what we're talking about here is thinking about an increasingly hungrier and more populous planet. And the question there is, how do we then going to reach that challenge of feeding those, those people in a more sustainable fashion that's not going to cost the earth, both in terms of economics, but also nature as well. And really, when we think about this, there's a great potential that lies within water. And we're thinking about blue foods. Blue foods have an enormous potential. They're some of the most highly traded products globally, and we're going to hear a little bit more about that this morning. And they provide livelihoods for millions of people. They're nutritious. They provide nutrients for billions of people on a daily basis. Incredibly, incredibly important. Demand for these foods is expected to double by 2050. And much of this demand is going to be met through aquaculture production. So really great, exciting potential, and we're going to explore more of this here this morning. The great news is that this can be undertaken in a nature-positive fashion. And this will certainly achieve not only feeding people, but it'll preserve critical habitats, protect and encourage biodiversity, as well as boost climate resilience. Incredibly important dimensions of what we're thinking about today, and things that we think about on a daily basis. And I think, you know, what's surprising and fascinating is that you have an aquaculture industry that really wants to play a very important role in this. You know, they are thinking, actually, we have an opportunity to contribute to this, not only feeding people, but we can address things like biodiversity, climate, economic issues as well. So I think this is incredibly exciting, and we're seeing some amazing collective efforts that's progress through industry and the like, and these sort of associations. And we're going to hear more about that this morning. But of course, achieving some sort of guidance is incredibly important to sustainable development and the growth of aquaculture, and wants to be done in a very sustainable fashion. And this is really seen as vital for blue food production. And when we think about this, I ask you to think about the connections that blue food, aquaculture can make, not just to things like production and consumption and the ocean, but what can it do in terms of issues around gender, poverty, climate I've mentioned earlier. And so it's almost a sort of an access point to addressing a whole range of SDGs that we're all concerned about. I think it's a really interesting dimension. So I think the Global Sustainable Aquaculture Roadmap is an instrumental guide for transformative action across aquaculture value chains and the overall sector. And really the Ocean Action Agenda, the Friends of Ocean Action, the World Economic Forum are really proud to share this work, to have produced it by the Blue Food Partnership and FUTUREFISH, and with the generous support from the UK's Blue Planet Fund and the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. So I'm really excited to hear more about this, and you'll be able to see, this is already online, you'll be able to look at it, and I look forward to this panel. So back to you, Michael.
Thank you very much, Christian, for that introduction. Now, what I'd like to do is to introduce the roadmap, and that will lead into a panel session that will talk in more detail about various aspects of the roadmap. So this Global Sustainable Aquaculture Roadmap sets out a clear direction around key focus areas to achieve greater sustainability for aquaculture. It prioritizes action areas. It identifies great opportunities to collaborate. The roadmap was developed with a systems change thinking. The aquaculture system, from production through to consumer, is incredibly diverse, incredibly geographically spread, many people involved, many types of geographies, production systems. So it's important to stand back from that, take a systems change thinking and analysis and start to tease out what are some of the key areas for action. So that's what the team did, and that's what we're presenting back to you today. There are 4 areas that have been identified for action in the roadmap: responsible production, better livelihoods, healthy consumption, and create an enabling environment for all this positive change to take place. I'll introduce briefly those dimensions. Firstly, responsible production. We recognize that there's been tremendous progress in sustainable aquaculture during the past few years, but more can be done to make production systems more sustainable. The roadmap identifies sort of 2 areas where change can and should take place. Firstly, with wider adoption of responsible production practices, with increasing focus on mitigation of climate impacts, and taking much greater care with biodiversity, and moving forward to a more positive climate contribution from aquaculture and a more nature positive aquaculture production system. So this is highlighted in the roadmap. Secondly, the need to support, develop innovations. The sector, the environment in which the sector is developing is changing. We need to be more innovative. We need to support new innovations to come up to address the various challenges. The second big area is around increasing the impact of sustainable aquaculture on livelihoods and the working environment for aquaculture in terms of the people involved and the communities where aquaculture takes place. There is a recognition that much more can be done to increase the positive benefits that a growing aquaculture sector offers for people in diverse community and circumstances across the globe. There are 2 areas that are given particular attention. Firstly, improving the benefits, taking more action to improve the benefits to small-scale actors, producers, the many women and people involved across the aquaculture value chain. We can be more proactive, invest in solutions that benefit the diversity of small-scale actors that make up the majority of people involved in aquaculture globally. And secondly, to adopt policies and practices that focus on decent work for all and inclusive growth of aquaculture. The third area is consumption. Blue foods are a tremendous, climate-friendly, healthy product. We can and should do more to get healthy products, healthy farm blue foods into food choices, into the diets, into healthy diets of consumers worldwide. So healthy consumption is a key pathway for change, for increasing the impact of aquaculture. We can facilitate better access to the diversity of farm blue foods by working with retailers, distributors, and food service providers, and raise consumer awareness about the health benefits of blue foods to enhance demand, enhance healthy food choices for blue foods. And the fourth area is around the enabling environment and equipping the aquaculture sector for a changing world in terms of building networks, partnerships, and working closer together, creating an environment in which the sector can sustainably grow and increase its impact. Two areas are given attention in the roadmap. One, increasing the quality, efficiency, and application of data and knowledge sharing systems, supporting evidence-based policy development, supporting evidence for the right investments. And secondly, policies and practices that allow sustainable aquaculture to grow and provide decent work and opportunities for inclusive growth. Finally, there are many areas for action. The roadmap is global in nature, and one size does not fit all. Different geographies, different production system, different communities, different people involved. Different actors have different responsibilities. And there are many ways in which those actors can take action. This slide shows a few supporting its development and implementation. Strongly encourage the different actors in aquaculture to come together, make commitments based around those 4 pathways. And if we all make that commitment to engage positively in those 4 key areas, then we will be able to achieve the change and the sustainability of aquaculture that we're all seeking for a better future. So thank you very much. I'm going to sit down now, and I'm going to ask some questions of this amazing panel that I have here today. Patrick Roulet, the co-founder and CEO of Aquafoods. Florenza Michecelli, co-director of Stanford Center for Ocean Solutions. Catherine Breyer, global marketing director of Biomar, and Chris Nines, CEO of the Aquaculture Stewardship Council. My first question to Patrick, I'm going to ask you about the sustainable production area and your views on the key actions that need to be taken with responsible production. Patrick.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. I think there's like several aspects and challenges that obviously we're concerned about. We talk about climate change. We talk about growing demand for animal protein. The world is growing. We're talking about health concerns, as well as use of resources in an efficient way, as well as the impact that our activities produce. So I think there's several aspects and preoccupations that we have out there, and I believe, and we believe really, that aquaculture is the answer for many of those things. But our approach as a company is not through a single species. I don't believe one species can handle it all. I think a multi-species approach is definitely the way, because there's different ways to approach each one of these things. And I personally believe, and we as a company believe, that before we start discussing specifics about on how we do things, there's several questions that we need to answer before we understand if our activity will be successful and maintained during the time. And the first one is, which species? What are we producing? There are several projects that are really beautiful out there, but then you have the market reality. And if you want to scale up and make sure the activity will bring the impact and will be able to scale to the levels that you have, you need to understand what are you farming and if there's a market for that. So I think that's one of the approaches we had, and this led us to develop farming of snapper. So we're the first and only snapper producers. And the reason why we wanted to farm snappers was mainly driven by market, but also the effect that we saw in the market of snapper production. And we understand how the coastlines were really affected by overfishing, by shrimp trawlers, killing a lot of the biomass that was out there, by agricultural production that was somehow affecting a lot of these river mouth areas and these biological places. So our approach was, okay, there is a demand for a species that no one is currently producing with a high impact, and how we make that happen. Well, it took us 10 years and millions of dollars to make sure we could overcome, you know, the aspects of biology, but it works. And after that, then we start basically understanding how many companies made a good job as far as how you can do the things and how you can farm fish in the right way, which is the second thing that you need to answer when you start developing one of these projects. Which species, how we want to farm, and where we want to farm. I think one of the mistakes we aquaculture without paying attention into what's going on out there. So if we want to farm something, we need to make sure it's a native species. One of the things we found out is that if we had an escape in our farm, I think overall the population would be quite happy, because it will be populating again, you know, the biological stocks that we have out there. But more than that is how we think about solutions on the coastal areas with tropical species, where there's a huge demand not only for work, but also for solutions where you can provide an impact in the environment. So our approach as a company is to develop these areas, and understanding that if we want to really bring a change and an impact, it is something that needs to be scalable. So understanding how the market's going to react with that, because you can be a billionaire, you can eventually hire a very good chief marketing officer, but it's going to be really, really hard thing to do to build something if nobody knows about it. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I think it's a huge challenge. So if we address production towards market consumption, so what is out there and possibilities that exist, I think there's ways on addressing all these concerns that we have at the beginning with something that could probably endure in time, because there is a market that will consume that product, and then you can bring the change towards that line. So this is mainly the approaches that we had with all the difficulties that it brings, but understanding that we have an opportunity to do so. And I think the market understands that, and they're willing to contribute once you start making those first steps.
Okay, thanks, Patrick, and emphasizing that species choices, but also driven by market demand. And thank you for that. We may come back and dig deeper into some aspects of that, but thanks. That was a great starter there on our responsible production side. Fiorenza, let me ask you about the livelihoods area pathway in the roadmap. What do you think about the roles of small-scale actors, particularly women and younger people, and how they can be supported through sustainable aquaculture? Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming. Well, the growth of aquaculture offers really huge opportunities to support livelihood, and harnessing these opportunities perhaps starts with acknowledging the diversity of the sector, the huge diversity of roles that span the supply chains from production and processing and distribution and sale, with examples that range from production for consumption in households all the way to export in international markets, high-end products. Vast variation in the use of technologies, in infrastructure that is available, in the governance structure. So this diversity of this, and this was really highlighted through the pandemic. With the shocks to markets, as well as every other aspect, think of our global community, that was associated with the pandemic, it was very clear that in some instances, the small-scale sector filled in the gaps left by other sectors with increased local production, food sharing, and local adaptation, and also huge seizing of opportunities, for example, digital platforms for direct sale, and other examples of very rapid adaptation. However, the pandemic also highlighted some huge, pretty major inequalities. And for example, these were manifested in the differential access that women have had during the pandemic through relief. And so some of the actions with the premise that every action needs to really be sensitive to context and to the cultural and social and governance context of each situation include in supporting the agency and engagement of small-scale actors, including women and young people. Often the small-scale sector, despite its importance in terms of nutrition and livelihood, is really undervalued and not included in decision-making. So that is a major path and starts with listening to the needs of the actors and the communities. A second cluster of actions regards large-scale actors and companies that can improve working conditions and a more equal flow of benefits to workers, and also the need for accountability. More transparency in wages, in safety in working conditions, etc., and that perhaps could be criteria included in seafood certification standards as well, more broadly. A third cluster of action concerns the support of coalition, cooperative networks, and other forms of associations that support access rights to the actors engaged in the small-scale sectors and the transfer of knowledge, they foster innovation, and are a huge element, have been in examples that range from cooperatives in Latin America to networks of fish processors and traders, women in Africa, are key in creating the enabling conditions for adaptation. So rather than inputs, creating the condition for that I think Chris is going to talk more about. And then fourth, and really importantly, gender-sensitive, gender-inclusive policies that, for example, secure land and resource tenure to women, a more equitable flow of benefits, including wages and other benefits. So a system approach, a context-specific approach that acknowledges the diversity, but also doesn't become paralyzed by it, because some of these clusters of actions broadly apply across different typologies of small-scale actors. And then really stressing again the importance of supporting women and young people as a key for delivering the benefits of the small-scale sectors in terms of social impact and a more sustainable and equitable blue food system, and also sort of the imperative in terms of equality that was so powerfully highlighted during the pandemic, what the inequalities in the sector.
Thank you, Irene. So that's great, and finishing with that emphasis on women and youth and equity. I think that's a very powerful message, and that pathway in the roadmap really emphasizes that. And I think that now we need to move to action and encourage many to take action in this area. But thank you so much for that. Catherine, over to you now. Healthy consumption. This is the third and a big pathway. As Patrick said, without the market, without the consumers, we're not. There's nothing to produce, really. So tell us, what role can retailers, distributors, and food service providers, that aspect of the industry, what role can that play in raising awareness about blue foods and aquaculture practices, and also maintaining diversity in diets, and in ways that we can really drive forward and meet all these opportunities for blue foods to be part of a sustainable and healthy diet in the future?
Thank you, Mike. First thing we need to remind ourselves, people out there that rely daily for blue foods as their main source of protein. We cannot ignore the importance of that, and we must be, as a human species, be able to create nutrition, these nutrient-dense blue food options. And while in the West we often think of the top 3 species that we are consuming all the time, the truth is blue foods actually have over 3,000 different species, from fish and crustaceans to algae, the work. So there is opportunity across the entire sector, across the entire globe, to provide nutrient-dense blue food solutions for everybody. So we can't take a one approach, we can't take a one Western approach, one country approach. As Patrick was saying, what is the market and what foods can you provide for those markets, and how best can you farm them in that ecosystem that doesn't degrade the ecosystem and allows for accessibility to blue foods that people want to actually eat. That's the first thing. And that's, of course, what the roadmap is giving us, a direction in this way. So we're not taking from the planet, we're actually working in harmony with the planet. The second thing is then to say, okay, so you've got these people who daily are out there fishing. Maybe there are women who are out in the waters and only bringing food home for their family. Some of them have actually very small little farms that are not commercial farms, little farms that they provide for their communities, and they barter with other women in their community to bring that nutrition. And we must remember also with the nutrition that with the equality that comes with that is the health benefits that have, and that's healthy consumption leads to good education, people that are in a way to actually absorb education when our minds are fresh, and we know seafood delivers all of those healthy omegas and everything for improving our brain and so forth, so we can't ignore that as well. Then we look to the West, and what can we do? We can't rely on the top 3 species for ourselves. We need to diversify our plate. And how are we going to go about that? Well, the responsibility to that, as you said, relies in the retailers to open up the doors and the seafood counter to be more than the top 3 species. And also the chefs. And I look a lot towards the chefs because they are our taste makers. They are the ones who give us the flavors and the recipes and the ideas that we absorb and then can take home and spread amongst our families and create our own access to that. Because with these 3,000 species, I certainly do not have a recipe book at home with 3,000 different species of fish in it. So how are we going to bring those into our homes and in our communities? Well, I would look to the chefs, and there's some great, in America recently, the Coalition for Sustainable Aquaculture Chefs has just been formed. Those people I would be looking to bring in the diets and the recipes to open our minds. And communication will be absolutely key. And we have to be listening to people who say the right things, the people who are not dispelling myths that were relevant 20, 30 years ago. Aquaculture has evolved. It is with standards, ASC being one of them, MSC in the wild as well, amongst others, that are making sure that farmers and fishermen are doing the right things. We must remember and stop holding blame to those people. I'm a farmer's daughter. I know farmers are generally just fairly simple people. Fishermen are fairly simple people just trying to do things. They're not scientists. They don't know what they do or didn't do and what was wrong. But now that they've learnt, they have changed. So let's get over the bad things, because humanity has done a lot of bad things. You know, it is not about looking to the past, but looking to the future and to listening to scientific experts, not YouTube wannabes, and listening to the facts and absorbing those and moving our place forward. And that's why communication, whether it be at retail, whether it be by the chefs, whether it be good documentary series, whether it be fantastic blue food books, which are going to be launched soon, and listening to people, that's where we're going to actually bring about change. Because if we remove and dispel these myths that are out there, we open the world to a blue foods future.
Well, thanks, Catherine. That was really diverse contribution as well, and thoughts from that 3 billion people through to some really positive communication recommendations that need to be taken, and engaging with chefs among a number of actions. Thank you for that. And that touches on, Chris, your area. Let me ask you about the enabling environment, and how can we get stakeholders, can we encourage multi-stakeholder cooperation?
Fellow panelists, Christian for the introductory remarks, and for the audience. I'm glad you could all make it here. But the enabling environment for many, I think, is something of a puzzle. But I think really all of the panelists have already alluded to many aspects of what a good enabling environment actually means. And I think if you think of it as a framework, both as a framework and a hierarchy, in the sense that you have international convention, you have national policies and laws, you have sector policies at a country level, you have codes of practice amongst the practitioners themselves, and of course, for the smaller scale producers, you also have norms and practices by which they govern their activities. So there is a very much an interconnection within having the correct enabling environment to make responsible aquaculture a success. And that environment itself is sometimes absent, sometimes incomplete in many places around the world, and sometimes even when it's there, a lack of implementation confounds the development of responsible aquaculture. So when we think about these things that need to be in place, we have to think carefully about what's actually needed. And yes, Mike, we definitely need collaboration and cooperation across all of the stakeholders involved within aquaculture production. But we have to do it with I believe, some sense of proportion, and to really understand what the problem or what the root cause of the problem is. Because unless you actually direct efforts to tackling the problem that's hindering the development of aquaculture, then it won't be effective. You'll spend an awful lot of time and energy setting loose expectations that in the end, if the problem's not been correctly identified, just won't be met. And you can waste a lot of time, a lot of resources, and create a lot of frustration. You know, we've talked a lot about the importance of small-scale producers within the sector, and you know, asking key questions about, you know, is there a sufficient framework in place that limits or provides for, you know, the right level of social practices within the sector, and you know, those could be at an international level with the International Labour Organization, all the way through to implementation at a local level. You know, is there thought to what the environmental carrying capacity can be? You know, what limits that, and what should be changed to make that more effective? You know, do small-scale producers have tenure? You know, many instances they don't. In the absence of tenure, they've got nothing to support or back up what might be most commonly used in terms of further developing aquaculture. How do you secure a loan if you don't actually own or have access to the land and the resources that you're using? So, you know, these things are absolutely key to actually bottom out to make sure that responsible aquaculture can flourish. We've talked a lot about the fact that seafood is the largest internationally traded commodity, but that still probably only represents about 20% of total aquaculture production. Far more aquaculture is produced and stays in country. So if you want to think about addressing global aquaculture production to make it more responsible, we've got to think beyond just those international supply chains. Of course, they're important, and yes, they can be great exemplars of how you can drive change, how you can promote better practices. But at the end of the day, there's far more to solving this problem than just thinking about that international aspect. It's important, of course, but for more people, what's actually produced and consumed in country is the far greater part. So again, know your problem. It sounds simple, but if you want to engage multi-stakeholder collaboration, then making sure that you've defined that carefully means that you can expend all of that effort that's needed to improve it correctly. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I think we've got a little bit of time to run back to the panelists with a quick second question, and just I'd like you to reflect briefly on just the diversity of aquaculture, species, systems, actors, and I'd like to push you a little bit and just come up with one example of something positive and as a priority area that you would pick to put the roadmap into action. Is it okay? And Patrick, could I come to you with your responsible production industry experience? What's your priority
one
action?
takeaway from
Yeah, absolutely.
It's tough.
That was my job.
Oh,
Okay,
okay.
sorry.
I think I just want to come back to the root cause of the problem, right? So if we think about like what we're trying to address, at the beginning I was mentioning about several concerns that we have as human beings, as society. So I think it's what we really want to address. So I think the answer might be different depending on, you know, if we want to address hunger, we want to address poverty, we want to address, hopefully, within that, the climate change aspects that is affecting us. But I think it's very hard to address that combined with all the other things that eventually the Western world, as Catherine was saying, is sometimes polluting our minds and somehow creating effects on the things that we, or the opinions that we end up having. So I believe it's, if we're thinking on a global perspective, I think there's very interesting ways on the small scale farming, and specifically with species that are really easy to farm, that can be addressed to somehow change some behaviors and bring some change on that massive scale. But it's probably something that the Western world is not going to be looking at, right? So I think this is one of the things, if we're thinking about hunger, about addressing this large production that is probably coming from these small farmers, it's definitely one of the ways to go. And I think there's several species that work really well with that, but not everyone, because there's some species that are really hard to farm, and then it's really difficult for you to bring that change within that small scale fishery. So for me, it's really understand what's the focus, what do we want to address. And if you pick one of those, I think the outcome might be really.
And some of the successful examples of growth of small-scale aquaculture really illustrate this. For example, the expansion of shellfish aquaculture as part of concession of territorial use rights for fishing across Latin America, Mexico, Chile, where the cooperative itself developed a shellfish aquaculture that has a low environmental footprint, is highly nutritious, and is conducted leveraging the assets of the cooperatives for domestic and international markets. And then other examples of also, not to Patrick's point about the species that are low cost and require low technology, for example, the Seaweed Cluster Initiative in Tanzania, where women are supported in a network, in a coalition, to produce seaweeds. This is something that women across multiple villages now are doing. There were lots of challenges in the beginning that related to their access and the rights that they had to this labor opportunity, and then as it developed, it has brought livelihood, has very important impacts on nutrition and other dimensions. So I think that those are the elements that then create the conditions for innovation, for growth, for equality, I think rights and agency.
Thank you, Fiorenza. Catherine?
Yeah, thank you. So my point from the biodiversity part here is when we look at farming, you know, normally whether that be on land or in the ocean, we often see monocropping, one species being farmed at one time. And what Patrick is doing here and others are doing in Panama is there's multiple species: tilapia, the rose snapper, the cobia. So I challenge people the farmers to think about how they can farm with more than one species, integrating one of the 3,000 options that are climate friendly for your ecosystem that you're living in and farming in. But what you can put, and there are projects out there of salmon with seaweed being farmed together, with sea cucumbers living underneath, trials underway, sea cucumbers living underneath the salmon farm. So consider, like, from that biodiversity of species that will fit within that ecosystem. No species on this planet lives in silo. You know, we all are part of an ecosystem. And then to support that, let us as consumers broaden our minds, open up our minds to the possibilities of new products, and not just take salmon from the shelf or rely on the species that you've always had. You know, that cobia product, the rose snapper, that tilapia that they grow is something extremely special than you would get anywhere in the world. You know, open your thoughts and minds and try and taste and experience. And I think that's where we can have a huge difference.
Fantastic, thank you. That diversity coming through very strongly again. Thanks, Catherine. And 1 minute to you, Chris, for closing remarks.
Just one thing, right?
Okay.
Just one thing. Wow. I think mechanisms to funnel outward investment into the continued development of aquaculture, and it's been largely absent. I think there are some great examples emerging, and there's interest from the huge sources of financial capital for investment about the potential of aquaculture, but it needs to be properly channeled. So it needs the right enabling environment in country to make it work. I think Aquaspark, as a sort of holding company that brings together over sort of 300 investors from 25 different countries, all focused on promoting responsible aquaculture globally, is a really great example of a mechanism that could be replicated. It could also be supported further, because often the venture capital investments that come sort of mid to later stage in the development of aquaculture can be have quite short-term mentality in their thinking about what the exit strategy is. So blended finance to help cover that is an opportunity. But don't forget also the role of investing in technology, in the way that technology can be both disruptive in a positive way, but also that can also encapsulate social enterprise. So it's not about necessarily just about profit maximization. It's almost a democratization of increasing aquaculture production. So inward investment outward investment into the sector, and the role of supporting technology in that.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you also for raising that the importance of investment. I think the panel didn't touch on that, but obviously investment is a key part of the way forward. So thank you to the panel. It's a bit challenging to summarize that, and I won't attempt to do so, but I do feel we had some really helpful contributions and insightful contributions to that will influence many of us in taking the roadmap forward, and both in terms of responsible production, better livelihoods, and that strong messaging around small-scale actors, women and youth. The healthy consumption, Catherine, and just drawing that the importance of blue foods, drawing out the fact of the importance of blue foods to 3 billion, people on our planet, and then suggesting a number of actions that can be taken. That's extremely good. And Chris, thank you for your suggestions, ideas on the enabling environment. And I guess we're at the beginning here in many ways, and this is all about partnership and collaboration and creating that enabling environment where everyone can work together to progress this important and growing, sustainable aquaculture sector and globally. And I think we did emphasize that it's not about just one part of the world. This is a global, initiative, and to grow sustainably, that growth has to be inclusive across the world. So thank you very much to the panel. I should now, and I'm very pleased to hand over for closing remarks to Ilona Drury, Head of International Sustainable Blue Finance, Department for Environmental, Food and Rural Affairs in UK. Please.
I'll sit down. I should take the hotspot here. And we love an acronym. It's DEFRA for short, or really the Department of Environment. So it's a real pleasure to be here this morning, and I'd like to thank the World Economic Forum, Friends of Ocean Action, for organising the event and for inviting me to make these closing remarks. Thank you, Michael, for your moderating, and our panellists and audience. So this is a pivotal moment for the aquaculture sector, which will play a vital role in securing future food security. And as Catherine mentioned, this statistic of over 3 billion people really kind of resonates, who are dependent on fish as their significant source of protein, and that includes many of the world's poorest and most vulnerable. The UK is proud to have supported the development of the Friends of Ocean Action Global Sustainable Aquaculture Roadmap through our Ocean Country Partnership Programme, which is part of the UK's £500 million Blue Planet Fund. So the roadmap plays an important role in the UK's leadership on marine issues, and our aim for seafood to be produced and distributed in ways that protect marine ecosystems, ensuring longevity for future generations, whilst providing inclusive, and I think that's a word that we've heard a lot today, inclusive and sustainable livelihoods. So we know that future seafood demand will rely increasingly on the aquaculture sector. It's increasingly a critical part of the wider food system on land and in water, and developed responsibly and inclusively in a gender-sensitive way that takes into consideration youth and other kind of marginalised groups, has the potential to deliver greater social, economic and environmental benefits, which will help us to sustainably feed our ever-growing population. So through the Ocean Country Partnership Programme, the UK is partnering with countries to take a One Health approach to sustainable aquaculture. So taking that unified approach of improving the safety of food, the welfare of animals, and ecosystem health. So we aim to equip partner countries with the capability and capacity to build sustainable aquaculture systems that suit the unique and diverse social, environmental and economic ambitions of each country. So I think another thing that resonates with me from this discussion is the need for an international and global approach, but also one that's local and diverse. So the aquaculture sector faces, we've heard about some of them, and I agree, should sort of leave them behind about the challenges, but there's also opportunities, and I think it's crucial that we embrace the diversity of blue foods and blue food actors and solutions. So this will require a collaborative effort from industry actors, government, indigenous people, local communities, non-profit organisations, academic institutions, to conceive a vision for the inclusive and sustainable growth of aquaculture. So we encourage those committed to a more sustainable future for aquaculture to consider how the roadmap might apply to their unique context, responding to culturally appropriate and local needs. So thank you again to the panel, the audience, and to Friends of Ocean Action for organising this side event. And we encourage those attending here in Panama, as well as online and beyond, to continue these important conversations about opportunities to transform the aquaculture sector. Thank you.